Hello and welcome to UnHerd, I'm Freddie Sayers. Temperatures in Europe this summer are hot, very hot. The heatwave has been named Charon, after the boatman in Greek mythology that rows you after death over the river Styx to Hades and a never-ending life of hell. So nothing very dramatic then. TV channels have been finding new, ever deeper shades of red to colour in the map. But there's another side to this. Bjørn Lomborg, who is author of a new book, Best Things First, as well as best-selling author of a number of previous books, is what I would call a climate realist. He doesn't deny that global warming is taking place, but thinks we should be spending money in a smarter way in response to it. He's got some quite stunning statistics that suggest that if Europe really is getting hotter, fewer people each year are going to die. He joins us from Sweden to tell us more. Good to see you again, Bjørn.
Likewise, good to see you, Freddie.
I presume where you are also, the news has been kind of covered in talk of this heatwave, and it just sounds very grave. And I think we probably should start by saying for some people it will be. It can be more than uncomfortable. It can be dangerous for people.
Absolutely. First of all, look, if you're in a heat wave, you should definitely make sure you follow advice, that you have air conditioning, that you have enough fluids, that you stay inside where it's safe. It's dangerous. We're going to cover this later on. But, heat across the world in all kinds of shapes and forms kill almost 600,000 people each and every year. So this is not to be taken lightly, and certainly it's something we should be concerned about. Also, as you point out, global warming is real, and that means temperatures are going to rise. As temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves, and hence more of this problem. So that part is right. It's not about that this is untrue. It's about getting a sense of proportion.
So let's get into this. You point out a study that was recently published in the Lancet, which is the kind of premier medical journal here in the UK. We've had some issues with some of their reporting in the past, but it's a group of UK academics, and they have taken measurements from across a 20-year period, looking at how many people die in Europe from cold and how many people die of heat. Talk us through it.
So fundamentally, what you have to understand is that almost everywhere, there is a minimum temperature where people die the least. If you deviate from that minimum temperature, that is, if it gets hotter, you start dying more. If it gets colder, you start dying more. It's not very surprising. If you get hotter, eventually you get
Dehydrated.
Thank you very much. And then eventually there's a real risk that you end up with more risk for strokes. So it has a real death risk. And that's what you see on a population level. As temperatures go above the minimum temperature, the minimum death temperature, then you get more and more death. That's what we hear about, and that's absolutely true. But there's a similar curve down below in the cold range of the temperature. When it gets colder than the minimum death temperature, then you also start getting more health problems. This is something that we see very clearly. Every country in the world has more death in the winter than in summer. And this is mostly not because of influenza, although that might have part of it, but it's mostly because as temperatures get colder, people's bodily reaction is that their blood vessels constrict to keep your core body heat, temperature warm enough. That increases your blood pressure. So we know everywhere blood pressure increases as you're colder. And that means you have more risk of strokes and blood clots and so on. And that means you have more risk of dying. We know all of these things. This has been published widely for dozens of years. And what that means is, when you look at heat waves, yes, you're going to see more deaths from heat. But when you look at cold, you're actually going to see a lot more cold death. And what we see in Europe is that every time there's one person dying from heat, there's about 10 people dying from cold. You're not well informed if you only hear about that extra heat death, which is true and dramatically disconcerting for that person, unless you also hear about the 10 cold deaths.
So let's actually put the chart that you shared on the screen, which shows how many cold deaths and how many heat deaths there have been in Europe over the past 20 years. This is from that Lancet study. I mean, it looks very, very striking that there's no country that is where the red bar is even close to the blue bar. We should say we're actually going to put two charts on the screen. The one on the right is the one that I believe you created, which has the same scale for the cold and the heat. But the one on the left, slightly mysteriously, is what was published in the Lancet, which is supposed to be a bastion of scientific methodology. But they seem to have actually changed the scale to make the heat deaths look bigger. Is that what happened?
Much bigger. Look, if you're a researcher, it's fine. You can read a chart and actually see that there are two different sides of information. And what you can see on the chart that I've done is you almost can't see any heat death, which of course is why they blew it up to make it bigger. That's fine if your purpose is to get researchers to know what was the exact number. But if you want people to understand what is the size of heat and cold death, of course you need the same measurements on both sides of the axis. And that was what I did. And that's why I'm trying to point out, look, we know this, and they also write that very upfront in the abstract of the paper. We know that heat deaths are vastly outweighed by cold deaths everywhere. So in Northern Europe, in the UK, we're talking about maybe 800 or 900 people dying from heat death, and maybe about 45,000 people dying from cold, down into Spain and Italy, where it's only 5 cold deaths for every 1 heat death. But overall, this is what we see everywhere, much more cold death than heat death.
So does that mean that if Europe heats up and we see worse heat waves in the summer, but less cold spells in the winter, fewer people overall will die of temperature-related causes?
It means that in the first part of the movement. So when you have temperatures going up a little bit, you definitely see fewer people dying because you have a large number of cold deaths that now decline, and you have fairly few heat deaths that increases. Eventually, if temperatures keep increasing, you run out of cold deaths to avoid. And then you actually get an increase. So in Europe, we probably estimate towards the second half of this century, we'll probably end up seeing an increase in total heat and cold deaths, and possibly by the end of the century, an absolute increase from what it is today. But certainly over the next many decades, this is actually a net benefit for Europe.
I just got to interrupt you just to focus on that point, because you really, really don't hear that if temperatures are going up in Europe, at least in the short and medium term, fewer people are going to die.
And this is remarkable that we don't hear that. And that's, of course, because it's an inconvenient point. But surely we should hear all of these points. Again, what I wanted to also emphasize is none of these models take into account that we actually do adaptation. So one of the things we've found is everywhere in rich countries, heat deaths have gone down, despite the fact that temperatures have gone up. And that's basically because people have more access to air conditioning, and we're better able, when you're not poor, you're much more resilient to actually not die from heat waves. It's not very hard to not die from heat waves, because remember, heat waves hit in 1, 2, or 3 days. So stay out of heat in those very, very hot days, and you're fine. Cold, on the other hand, turns out to be much harder to deal with, because that's really month-long issues, and you have to keep your home heated for months. And this is hard, especially if you're poor. Again, we've probably seen historically declining levels of cold death just simply because people have gotten richer. But actually, in many rich countries, we see decreases in heat death, but increases in cold death, because it's so costly to do something about heating. And that, of course, also addresses the whole conversation that we have in climate. A lot of people would say, oh, we got to make fuels, especially fossil fuels, much more expensive so that we stop some of the problems that come from global warming. That sounds sensible. But if it actually means it becomes harder to keep your home heated in the winter, you may very well end up with more dead, not fewer dead.
And of course, cooler in the summer. I mean, across Italy and Greece and Spain and these places where it's so hot, the reason everyone is just about okay, or most people are, is because of air conditioning, which takes energy. So actually, at least in the short and medium term, people need more energy, and they need more economical ways to either heat or cool their homes.
Exactly. If you want to save people, that's the way to go. And also, and we should recognize this, there are very smart, simple ways to keep very large areas, so urban areas, cooler And we should definitely be embracing those. That's about having more water features, more greenery, more light surfaces. So paint the tarmac or the rooftops white or in a light color. That can dramatically reduce heat wave temperatures up to about 10 degrees centigrade, much, much more than any climate policy could do. And of course, much cheaper, much faster, and also prettier.
Some people are going to object, okay, this might sound fine for Europe, but what if you're in India? What if you're in China? What if you're in Africa? Is it a different story there? Apparently, I hear rumored that you might have another study from the same journal that suggests otherwise. Talk us through that.
A lot of people would suggest that obviously this must be different in India. Now, what is different is India has its minimum temperature, mortality temperature, much higher up. So whereas, the minimum mortality temperature, I believe in England is I forget, but it's 8 or 12 degrees or something. So, very cold. It's more like, 25 degrees in India. But when it's cooler than that in India, people start dying more. When it's hotter than that in India, people start dying more. And the vast amount of people dying in India die because the temperatures are lower, that is, they're colder than the minimum temperature. And so again, what you find is that about 70, 80,000 people die from heat in India each year, but about 600,000 people die from cold in India.
So you wouldn't think that listening to the news. I just thought we should put this chart that you shared up on the screen. More cold death than heat death everywhere.
This is the first study, again from the Lancet in 2021, that tries to estimate what are all of the world's population seeing from heat and cold. Now, again, we don't have good data from many places. Rich places have better data. So this is not absolutely certain, but it's the best evidence that we have, and certainly everywhere what they find, you have many more people dying from cold, that's the blue bars, than dying from heat. Actually, it's an interesting point that Europe is one of the least differential. So what they find is that Europe only has about a 4 times higher death rate from cold than heat.
It's definitely counterintuitive to see that Africa bar, where it's so many, more than 1 million people dying of cold, but very few dying of heat. There's a second chart that I thought we should share also, which is the change over time, where it's looking at the fact that as temperatures have changed, both the numbers of people dying from cold and heat have changed. Let's put that on the screen and have a look.
This is actually what they wanted to do. They wanted to show how have temperature changes over the last 2 decades. So from 2000 to 2019, where temperatures have gone up about half a degree. How much has that affected? And what it turns out is that while you see heat deaths going up, as you would expect, you also see cold deaths going down, and they're going down more. As you can see, the percentage has gone up from heat deaths about 0.2 percentage points, but it's gone down 0.5 percentage point for cold, which actually means that overall, over the last 2 decades, if you just look at temperature has saved more lives than it has cost. It's cost about 166,000 more heat deaths, but it's avoided about 283,000 cold deaths each year, which means each year we're now saving about 166,000 lives because of higher temperatures on the planet.
So what do you think we should be doing? This is the big question, isn't it? I mean, obviously all the focus and all the attention and a lot of the money and pain is going towards trying to slow the pace of climate change, trying to reduce the amount of energy we use and all the rest of it. This is net zero. It's the whole program that most Western and probably global countries have agreed on. What's the Bjørn Lomborg program? Where should we be spending time and effort and money instead?
So first, we should actually spend some money on green energy and on climate, but we should do so smartly. We should, as we talked about, focus on making sure that people have access to cheap energy so they survive both heat and cold, that we make cities cooler, that we adapt in many different ways. Those are the cheap and simple and obvious things that we should be doing. We also need to fix climate change in the long run. The only way we're going to do that is by making green energy cheaper than fossil fuels. Right now, we're trying to force on everybody stuff that's actually not as good. We're trying to force people to buy electric cars when they don't really want it, or bribe them. We're trying to force them to use less effective and less reliable green energy. We should make that energy cheaper and innovate that so that it actually is something not just rich, well-meaning people will do a little bit of, but everyone also, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Africans will want to buy. That's how we fix climate change.
So it's technology and it's market rather than top-down nudging and behavior change.
Well, it's not nudging if you're going to, for instance, prohibit fossil fuels. That is, drastic changes, and that's very likely just not going to be accepted even by rich populations, but certainly not going to be accepted in most of the rest of the world. While we do that, instead of spending trillions of dollars on something that will have very little chance of actually being accepted worldwide and will have fairly little benefits before the end of the century, we should be spending hundreds of billions of dollars in fixing climate smartly. But that would, of course, open up lots of resources to also remember there are lots of other problems. If you ask most people around the world, what do they care about? They care about the fact that their kids die from easily curable infectious diseases, don't have enough food, have terrible education, and so on. These are very simple, basic things that we should first address. And so I've actually just written a book, as you mentioned, called Best Things First, where we've tried together with lots of other economists to focus where can you spend money and help the world, especially the world's poorest, in the best possible way. Turns out that these are the simple things that we probably all kind of know, but we should be focusing a lot more on. So focus on tuberculosis and malaria, two diseases that are huge. Tuberculosis is bigger than COVID last year. It's been the biggest infectious disease killer at 1.5 million people over the last decade at least. We fixed this in the rich world. We haven't in the poor world. We should. And we, for about $6 billion, can avoid about 1 million deaths each year.
I should say, if viewers are interested in the other ones, which I'm sure they are, we will put a link to your book at the bottom of this video so they can find out more. Concluding thought, Bjørn, whether it's those two charts that we showed at the start, the way the data was presented and the way the data really should have been presented, or whether it's the news coverage at the moment, which always emphasizes one side, or whether it's the bigger question of why money isn't spent smarter and why we seem to be driven towards these kind of impractical ideological goals instead of simpler, better solutions. What's your explanation for it? Why is there such a movement towards strangely irrational sort of ideological answers to everything instead of a little bit more pragmatism?
I think to a large extent it's because this has become almost a religious experience. When you talk about climate change, it's not just we want to do something smart about a real problem called climate change. It's also become, I want to be this morally superior person. There's a right answer, and it's often, renewables like solar and wind. It's, curiously not nuclear power, which in many ways provides more baseload power. And if we can make it cheap, we're not there yet, then it could also be a safer and a much more effective solution to part of this. But there's sort of an ideological solar and wind, great, nuclear, not great. And likewise, we have this with all kinds of other things. So again, when there's heat waves, we see this all the time because it's sort of pushing the right argument. Krugman just today in New York Times says we should politicize the weather. We should actually make the arguments of saying, here are some things that are in the news, and this is why you should do my political program. That's not how we make smart decisions, but it is how we drum up support for our tribe. I think we need to get back and say, isn't our real goal to make the world as good as it can be? That is, both fix climate, but smartly and effectively, and also fix all the other problems smartly and effectively. If you're on board with that, we should be smarter than this. Unfortunately, right now, it's become more sort of a talk to your tribe. But I would like to believe that we can be smarter and better and more rational.
Bjørn Lomborg, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Bjørn Lomborg, making quite a lot of sense, I thought. If you want more of this, common sense and resisting the tribe mentality, then don't forget to subscribe. We'll put the link just up here and make sure you see all of our videos as they come. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.